in which they pretended to be her. This prompted Kelly to respond with some more sexually inappropriate letters, and their content was apparently so offensive that Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. I guess this was essentially the 1914 version of sexting, and he had to spend some time in a mental hospital for it. Well, by 1917, the investigation into other suspects in the Villisca Axe murders had completely fallen through, so they decided to focus their attention on Kelly again. The police brought Kelly in and interrogated him non-stop over the course of an entire night until he finally broke down and confessed to the murders the following morning. He claimed that God had commanded him to kill every person in the Moore household that night, and that he essentially did this while in a trance-like state. Of course, Kelly soon recanted his confession, but he still went on trial for the murder of Lena Stillinger. It seems like he was specifically charged with that one particular murder, because in addition to the incident involving the obscene letters, there were a lot of unsavory rumors about Kelly being a peeping Tom and abusing his position to ask young girls to pose nude for him. The logic seemed to be that since Kelly was a sexual deviant, that's why Lena was found partially nude. Maybe Kelly had become fixated on her at the Children's Day services that night, so he decided to follow her to the Moore home and then proceeded to kill everyone inside with an axe. The evidence against Kelly at trial was his confession, the letters he'd written about the murders, and the fact that he'd sent out a bloody shirt to be laundered only a week after the crime took place. There were also witnesses who claimed that they'd heard Kelly discussing the murders on his train trip from Villisca to Macedonia on June 10, 1912. Remember, this train had left Villisca at 5:19 a.m., 3 hours before the bodies were discovered, so how could Kelly have known about the murders unless he had been there? Well, the problem is that the witnesses who supposedly heard him talk about this changed their story, and given how questionable Kelly's confession was, this was hardly an airtight case. As a result, the jury wound up being deadlocked at 11-1 in favor of acquittal. So Kelly had to go on trial again, and this time, he was acquitted, and that pretty much closed the books on him. This also kind of brought the investigation to a dead halt, and that's about as close as they ever came to solving the Villisca Axe murders. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So here's my personal take on Reverend George Kelly as a suspect. He is most definitely a strange person and a major pervert, but I really don't think the evidence is there which points to him being the perpetrator. From the sound of things, the police only decided to charge Kelly 5 years after the fact because they'd gotten pretty desperate to close the case. You're going to hear other podcasters discuss the theory that Iowa State Senator Frank Fernando Jones hired a guy named William Mansfield to commit the murders, but after the investigation into them fell apart, I think there was a feeling that somebody had to go down for this crime, and Kelly was a convenient scapegoat. In fact, there were rumors that Senator Jones pressured investigators to orchestrate a frame-up job on Kelly in order to take the spotlight off himself. Now, Kelly's alibi on the night of the murders was that he was asleep, but it's not like anyone could officially verify it. During his trip to Villisca, Kelly stayed at the home of a local minister named William J. Ewing. He rode Kelly to his bedroom at 11 p.m. before he went to sleep, and that Kelly was already gone by the time Ewing woke up the following morning. We know that Kelly's train departed at 5:19 a.m., so he would have had a window of about 6 hours to commit the murders. Ewing and his wife were called in to testify at Kelly's trials, and they stated that they believed his bed had been slept in that night. Now, Kelly was left-handed, and the coroner believed the blood spatters at the scene indicated that the killer swung the axe left-handed. However, the biggest point in Kelly's favor was that he was a pretty small fellow at only 5'2" and 119 pounds. So would he really have been capable of murdering 8 people with an axe single-handedly? The fact of the matter is that there's no direct evidence placing Kelly at the scene. All we really have is a coerced confession, unreliable eyewitness testimony, and a strange guy who developed a strange obsession with this crime. I'm not saying it's absolutely impossible that Kelly could have done it, but in my eyes, he just seemed like nothing more than a convenient scapegoat, and if there hadn't have been so much pressure to solve the case at that time, I'm not sure he ever would have been charged. So I'm inclined to think that the Villisca Axe murders were committed by someone else. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and thanks again to Joe, Steve, and Devin for having me on here.
Charlie and Allie here from the Insight Podcast. We are covering one of the suspects who made maybe the biggest news, partly because of who he was in the community.
And that suspect is Frank Jones. He owned a large and successful store in Villisca, and Josiah Moore worked for him for something like 9 years. He helped found a bank in the town and was, at the time, serving as a state representative, and he later became a state senator. He spent 25 years as a superintendent of Sunday school for the Methodist Church. I know, something that you would look at as a murderer for sure. Now, the reason people looked at him as motive...
After working for Frank Jones for years, Josiah opened his own hardware store, and he worked in direct competition to Frank. Not only that, but he took the John Deere portion of the business with him when he left. Some people who work in corporate jobs today, they have to sign paperwork when they're hired that they won't take clients or accounts with them if or when they leave the company. This is why. Non-compete clauses have prevented many axe murders, I am sure of that. And according to one source I read, the two men, who obviously didn't speak to each other, would go as far as to cross the street to avoid each other.
And then there was gossip. Frank Jones had a daughter-in-law named Donna. Donna had a reputation for meeting with men without her husband or a chaperone present. Back in those days, you couldn't just make a private phone call. You had to go through a central operator who could, should she choose, listen in. She could then, should she choose, tell the whole town about your business. Now, it is rumoured that Donna and Joe arranged their meetups by telephone. So a business competitor and rumoured to be having an affair with his daughter-in-law, but there was dual motives for Frank Jones.
Eventually, the rumours of Frank Jones' involvement led to an investigation into him not being the murderer himself, but rather being the money behind a murder-for-hire plot. The man they thought wielded the axe is a potential serial killer named William Mansfield. Mansfield would later be suspected in the murder of his own family years later. One man in particular really believed this theory. James Wilkerson, a private investigator, was convinced that Frank Jones hired William Mansfield to kill the Moore family. He also believed other killings across the Midwest were connected, and he connected them all to William Mansfield. He said that he could prove Mansfield was in every area on the nights of all of these murders.
Frank Jones, tired of the rumours, which eventually escalated to posters hung up around town accusing him of the crime, he sued Wilkerson for slander. The best defence to slander is to prove what you said is true. So the defamation suit became kind of a mini murder trial for Frank Jones. Wilkerson had various eyewitnesses who saw and heard things related to the crime. This civil trial, however, happened in 1916, so 4 years after the murders. So why did no one say any of this at the time of the murders, and why are they only saying it now? One witness who had years previously testified at the inquest that he saw nothing unusual was now testifying, saying he saw the son of Frank Jones enter the Moore home while the Moores were still at the children's program.
In the end, Wilkerson was found not guilty of slander. Now, that's not to say the jury believed Frank Jones was involved in the murders, but that there was enough evidence that accusing him of being involved did not rise to the level of slander. A grand jury was convened, and the state sought an indictment against Mansfield. The details are private, as they tend to be with grand juries, but in the end they failed to indict Mansfield, reportedly because he had a payroll receipt, and it proved that he was in Illinois at the time of the murders. This essentially ended the legal case against Frank Jones, but this widely held belief that he used his influence to sway the investigation and the results of that investigation away from himself, it ruined his political career.
Now, to me, Jones had a lot to lose if it ever came out that he was involved in the murders. And I can't see, look, even if he was, I imagine he would have had it all sewn up tight so it could never be traced back to him. But honestly, I think him being tied to the case is just a case of Mansfield's obsession with the murders.
One of the things that really leads me away from him is that slander case. He had to know with his own background, that taking a defamation case to court, he's saying I'm a murderer, I'm not a murderer, that was going to turn into a de facto murder trial for him. And if he had something to lose, I don't think he would have done that.
Because a lot of dirt could have come out in that defamation case. He was risking a lot.
Right. And I don't think he would have risked it over a defamation case that was already going to be difficult to win, because defamation cases are famously difficult to win.
I'm Nate. Villisca isn't the only place for an axe murder. How about Blue Island, Illinois, 1914? Blue Island is in Cook County, just south of Chicago, and on July 6th, there was a gruesome axe murder of a family. Jacob Nislesla, his wife, their daughter, and their infant grandchild were killed. The survivor of the attack? Jacob's son-in-law, William Mansfield. Mansfield was working out of town when his family was killed, and we know that 2 years later, in the summer of 1916, Mansfield was working for the railroads in Kansas City. Now, Mansfield was thought to be a troublemaker because of his work as a union organizer. This Detroit girl knows how poorly union organizers were thought of by those in positions of power, particularly at the start of the 20th century. James Wilkerson, of the Burns Detective Agency, he felt that because of what happened in Illinois years earlier, Mansfield was good for the murders. He was convinced that Senator Jones hired Mansfield to do the deed. Wilkerson went so far as to hang up hundreds of flyers on lampposts all over the city, labeling the fair-haired, blue-eyed Mansfield William the Lackey Mansfield, and implying that Jones had hired him to commit the murders on his behalf. Mansfield was arrested and brought before a Montgomery County grand jury. Mansfield's attorneys, they produced payroll records and witnesses that placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca attack. Mansfield was released, and he filed suit against Wilkerson and the notoriously anti-union Burns Detective Agency. He received $2,200 in damages. In today's money, that's a $50,000 settlement. Devin, Steve, Joe, congratulations on 4 years of making the magic happen. Can't wait to see what you do next.
Hey everyone, this is Michael from the Unresolved Podcast. The Villisca axe murders remain one of America's most enduring mysteries because of the brutality of the crimes and the eerie mystery that followed. One of the theories that surfaced in the days afterwards hinged on the witness statements provided by Faye Van Gilder, the daughter of matriarch Sarah's sister, and it involved the inclusion of a man known by the name of Joe Ricks, who was found the very next day with circumstantial evidence. Faye Van Gilder, the 16-year-old niece of Joseph and Sarah Moore, had stated that she had seen a man on the morning before the murders. Faye told investigators that this man had been demanding to know where the Moore family lived. When she gave the rough description of the man to her aunt, Sarah Moore, hours before the older woman's death, she was told that a man matching that description had been hanging around the area suspiciously. So it stands to reason that whoever this man was, he was likely involved in the murders, or at the very least, should have been suspected of them. At least one other witness in Villisca recalls seeing a man who would call himself Joe Ricks in the town of Villisca that day, asking for directions. This would become relevant the day after the murders, on June 10th of 1912, when Joe Ricks shuffled off of a train wearing bloody shoes. That's right, you heard me correctly. Joe Ricks had traveled to Monmouth, Illinois, from a town just 15 or so miles south from Villisca, named Clarinda. When he got off of the train, a state away, other travelers became alarmed by the blood on his shoes, meaning that it must have been somewhat noticeable. Police were contacted and Joe Ricks was detained. Faye Van Gilder, the niece of the murdered family, was transported out to Illinois along with a county attorney to identify the man. She did not recognize Joe Ricks as the man she had seen the day before, but I'd like to remind everyone listening how trustworthy eyewitness testimony can be. If someone asked you to identify a person you briefly saw a week beforehand, could you? Especially if that person had done anything to change their appearance whatsoever, as Joe Ricks could have possibly done. Either way, Joe Ricks told investigators that he had obtained the bloody shoes in a trade with another passenger on the train. A tramp, so to speak. Does that sound fishy to you? Because it sounds pretty freaking fishy to me. I mean, who would trade for bloody shoes? After Faye Van Gilder was unable to identify the man she had seen on the morning before the murders as Joe Ricks, police never further investigated him and just simply let him go. I personally think that this was a major mistake in the investigation, and it's a reason why the story is still unresolved.
Hi, we are Thin Air Podcast, which is me, Daniel Calderon.
And me, Jordan Sims.
If you haven't heard of us, our podcast covers cold missing persons cases and the social issues behind them. So when our friends at Thinking Sideways asked us to discuss this creepy murdery case, we were like, yes, awesome. But it's also somewhat different from what we regularly do.
Our podcast usually features one missing persons case at a time. Daniel and I take turns telling each story, so we don't really interact with one another in our episodes. So what we're going to try today is, I have done some research on this case. Daniel is going to kind of come in blind.
Yeah, I don't even know the name of this case, actually.
Right, so it's going to be an interesting experience to kind of see how it goes. The way that we're going to talk today is not the tone of and structure of our regular show. We're much more serious. We don't talk back and forth, but today we're experimenting.
Trying something new.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited. If you want to check out one of our regular, normal episodes that are not like this, we would love for you to check us out over at thinairpodcast.com. We're also, Facebook, Twitter, the whole shebang. So yeah, feel free to check us out.
So what is the case that we're talking about today?
It's a very horrific, notorious crime. This happened on June 9th of 1912. In the house this night are Joe, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 sisters who are spending the night.
Someone comes in with an axe and kills all 8 people?
Yeah, so these were really grisly set of murders. They're known as the Villisca Axe Murders. And today our task is not to go into detail about the specifics of the crime itself, but we have a theory, and our specific theory was the theory of George Myers. So we're going to launch into that right now. This is where we flash forward 19 years or so to March 28th, 1931. This is when a man named Leroy Robinson, also known as George Myers, I think he's more known as George Myers.
Okay.
He's sitting in a jail in Detroit, Michigan. He burglarized a house. All the reports I could find online, we used research at the time, so newspapers around this time, said that he was burglarizing a home and he had been trapped inside, which to me is like kind of a stupid criminal
trapped
thing.
Inside of a house?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Like in a chimney, or like you get your foot stuck in the dishwasher?
Like you close yourself in a closet hoping no one sees you.
And then you get stuck in the closet, locked in the closet.
You get trapped in the closet. So to me, if you're getting trapped inside a house you're robbing, you're not like a master
criminal. But the thing about the
criminal.
Morris person is that, were they smart?
Okay. I don't know. Yeah, it wasn't like that was like this super high-tech criminal mind thing. But
I mean, he covered all the windows, though, and took all that time.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah, okay. Just because he got caught doesn't mean he couldn't have committed this crime.
Sure.
But to me, they seem sort of incongruous. Incongruous? Can you tell me how to say that word?
Incongruationals?
Okay, perfect. So he's sitting in this jail. Detroit police receive an anonymous letter. And this letter basically says, I have the exact thing, I should probably read it. If you go to the Wayne County Jail and interview a man named Myers, you will learn something about a murder in Villisca, Iowa 19 years ago, a particularly horrible murder.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, it's obvious what murder they're referring to.
I mean, right. It also says murder. 1. When you say murders...
I mean...
Or would you all roll them into one?
I guess it could... Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either.
Tricky
Anyway.
noun.
Tricky noun. So, they go to Myers, Leroy Robinson, our guy, and they say, hey, did you do this? We got this letter. And at first he denies it, and he's sort of, no, you're not going to pin this on me. How dare you? I've never been there. And then... he confesses. Newspapers at the time published what he said, and I've taken a selection of that. So this is a direct quote from his statement, his confession. The basic story is that he, at the time in June of 1912, was in Kansas City, which is about 2.5 hours south by car from Villisca. A man approaches him. So here's his statement, just to set it up.
Sure.
I just got out of jail, I guess. I was having a drink when a man walked up and looked me over. After a few drinks, he told me there was a family in Villisca he wanted to get rid of, and that it was worth $5,000 to be done. I agreed to do it. He said he didn't care how it was done, except that there must be no shooting, as it would make too much noise. For me, the plot thickens with this stranger, because why would you have a vendetta against an entire family? So there's the theory with the senator who had this very spiteful relationship with Joe Moore. So maybe this stranger was somehow connected to the senator. But it's like, he specifically says, I have a family that I need taken care of. Why on earth would you want a whole family